there was some discussion about whether or not we could ignore Canada Day. Obviously, we decided not to, not this year, as the colonial project of Canada turns 150 years old. Canada has a checkered past. We have many incredible people and institutions worthy of celebration. Public health care and a powerhouse women's national soccer team, as well as a painful history of genocide and internment and disenfranchisement, a history that continues to be felt in communities passed down through generations. This celebration and this grief are both true, and the combination of them is uncomfortable. And there is no path to transformation, individual and collective transformation, that doesn't first take us through discomfort, through deep and sometimes painful reckoning. Individually and collectively, we are not and have never been perfect. Pretending otherwise does us no good. But preaching, I'm always reminding myself, is about sharing the good news. And the good news lies in the possibility that our past mistakes might transform us. Now, for a little perspective, in the scheme of geological history, a 150-year birthday is pretty little. Even on a timeline of human history, 150 years is very young. This past spring, an ancient village was discovered in Heiltsuk territory, 500 kilometers northwest of Victoria. The village is believed to be one of the oldest human settlements ever found in North America. The remains that were found were estimated to be 14,000 years old. Older even than Egypt's pyramids. Older even than this biblical story that we just heard, and that we would maybe also like to avoid. The cringe-worthy story of a God who demands that Abraham kill his only son, except that Isaac was not really his only son. Isaac was his second son, born to Abraham and his wife Sarah, who might have also been his half-sister. Sarah, after a lifetime of infertility, had Isaac, and God demanded that Abraham kill him so that Abraham could prove his fear of, and therefore his love for, God. Yikes. So I don't need to tell you that this story doesn't work particularly well for me. Like the overt nationalism of Canada Day, this is a story that I would rather avoid. And it too is fertile ground for recognizing and participating in transformation. You see, God has changed since Abraham's time, or at least our understanding of our relationship with God has changed since Abraham's time. And even saying changed feels like it's understating it. Our understanding of God has been transformed. It hasn't happened quickly, and if you're looking, it's certainly still possible to locate evidence of that God of Abraham in hearts and hymns and liturgies. That is where we come from, but it's not all of who we are as Christians, and it certainly doesn't need to be where we are headed. I'm of a generation that is more comfortable with change than with stagnation. It's what we're most accustomed to, so I'm drawn to process theology. Process theologians speak about things that do endure, including electrons and molecules and cells, and they say the human soul. And they speak about events and experiences that are distinct and that do not endure over time, that arise and become and reach completion. But even these distinct events, they say, have an essential relatedness. So theologian John Cobb, who I already mentioned, explains that even these distinct events are not independent and separate. They are essentially related to previous experiences, and their relationship to these past events is primary. The academic language of process theology can get me confused, and I had to read it over and over again, but the central piece is that everything is informed by everything that came before it. There's no it that isn't part of a web of relationships and processes. Now, here in this sanctuary, that may seem obvious, but it's such a deeply countercultural notion that I think it bears repeating. Everything is informed by everything that came before it. It's particularly significant because the process theologians include God in this calculation, that God is informed by who God was before. Our faith is shaped by an ancient history of a God who demanded horrific tests as proof of love, and it has been simultaneously shaped over thousands of years by astounding acts of love. In powerfully clear language, Cobb says, present occasions feel past occasions. This implies, he says, that each occasion is a selective incarnation of the whole past universe. I love that line as a theological statement. Each occasion is a selective incarnation of the whole past universe. It means that our activities will make a difference throughout the future. Future occasions will feel us. So it's in that sweet middle spot that we find ourselves today, between feeling the past and impacting the future. We are created and creating beings of a creator and creating God. And that's the middle spot that we find ourselves in today amid celebrations of Canada's 150th birthday. We live, we worship on land with a history of genocide. We are the descendants of survivors, and for a great number of us, descendants of perpetrators and beneficiaries of that physical and cultural genocide, or more recent immigrants and settlers onto a land with that history. More stunning is how that history continues to be felt today, felt in a variety of legal and resource and land disputes where the government of Canada is on one side fighting against Indigenous people, where our shared tax dollars are used to resist the rights and health and title of Indigenous people. That history is being felt by the massive overrepresentation of Aboriginal children in foster care and Aboriginal people incarcerated in prisons and Aboriginal people in our homeless populations. Symptoms, all of them, of intergenerational trauma and symptoms of a systemic bias in our institutions that shame and blame and penalize Aboriginal people more quickly than supporting them. How we react to these things is what defines who we are and what defines who we become into the future. And one way to react is to apologize. In 1986, the United Church of Canada apologized to First Nations people for the pain and suffering caused by the residential schools, and they reached further back in history to apologize for the physical and theological damage done by early missionaries and colonists. It took until 2008 for the Government of Canada to apologize for residential schools. And both of these apologies were powerful moments of being in relationship with and being transformed by our past mistakes. The United Church's 1986 apology from the Right Reverend Bob Smith read in part, "Long before my people journeyed to this land, your people were here, and you received from your elders an understanding of creation and of the mystery that surrounds us all that was deep and rich and to be treasured. We did not hear you when you shared your vision. In our zeal to tell you of the good news of Jesus Christ, we were closed to the value of your spirituality. We confused Western ways and culture with the depth and breadth and length and height of the gospel of Christ. We tried to make you be like us, and in doing so, we helped to destroy the vision that made you what you were. As a result, you and we are poorer, and the image of the Creator in us is twisted, blurred, and we are not what we were meant by God to be. Now, good, heartfelt, and well-articulated apologies are hard to come by, and the church in this apology, I think, did very well. The problem usually is that even in apologizing, we would still like to be right. Our brain jumps in to conceal or to protect our heart. Comedian Amy Poehler wrote in her 2014 book about a gut-wrenching mistake that she made on live TV to Saturday Night Live's millions of viewers. And she wrote about the 3 years that it took her to apologize, in which that mistake ate away at her. Poehler gives 2 examples in her book of apology letters, one from the brain, an apology that attempts to explain and justify, to clear your name, and an apology from the heart that takes risks, that admits imperfections, and that asks for nothing in return. An apology from the heart means risking a brokenness that may not be mended in your lifetime. And it creates the uncertain, the uncontrollable space for transformation. It's a choice, and like everything, a calculation of what can be gained and what might be lost. Each mistake, all of our reckoning, presents an opportunity. Put up a safe, strong wall, or crack open a little bit more. No part of process theology, no aspect of the science of evolution, no review of human history suggests that we will always choose right. There's no guarantee that being people in process means that we are people who will naturally progress. Sometimes, many times, we, our leaders, our governments, get defensive, or we don't pause to reflect. We refuse to feel past events, and our mistakes compound upon one another. How we react is a choice, and these choices are intimate and risky. Everything is informed by everything that came before it, but how we react is what defines who we are and who we become. The cliche may be that Canadians say sorry too often, but to do it well, to admit our imperfections without needing to explain and justify, and to really, really be willing to be transformed by them, we could all do a little bit more of that. The Government of Canada's formal apology paved the way for the 5.5-year Truth and Reconciliation Commission process. Many of you, I suspect, participated in some events related to that process. The United Church's 1986 apology has led us into deeper relationships with Indigenous people through church structures like the Aboriginal Ministries Circle and through shared advocacy and faithful public witness efforts. It may be for some of us that these heart-driven apologies on Indigenous rights don't see resolution in our lifetime, that they feel like picking at wounds from the past. But I want to tell you, when the Government of Canada made that apology in 2008, I was working as a youth and family worker at an elementary school in East Van that was primarily Aboriginal families. And that morning, our lunchroom/gymnasium/auditorium was packed with kids and families watching. And there was not a dry eye in sight. I have seen the pride of young Indigenous dancers at the Friendship Centre and the love of elders and grandchildren at the annual Women's Memorial March. I've heard the hip-hop of A Tribe Called Red and watched the round dances of Idle No More. These apologies have shifted the burden of blame and responsibility, and young generations of Indigenous people are transforming themselves, their communities, and this country. We are in the early days of this transformation. In time, it will, I hope, entirely transform this country, and it will require all sorts of shifts that may upset the current balance of power, but we will all be richer for it. The God that our ancestors knew and wrote about was vengeful, had a fragile ego, played favorites, and that God was evident in our actions. With courage and with resistance, we have been reacquainted with God again and again throughout human history. We have learned and grown and adapted in how we live and how we relate to one another. And along the way, we have encountered God doing the same. Dr. Martin Luther King famously quoted theologian Theodore Parker in saying, "The moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends toward justice." In contrast, process theology says that the divine power is persuasive but not controlling, that the unfolding of justice is not inevitable. It will not happen without our participation. But when we participate in that work, we do so in the presence of God. When we soften our hearts to make amends for past errors, when we are willing to loosen our grip on control in order to be transformed, when we show up and do the tangible work of bending the universe toward justice, we are living into the pull of a God who has transformed and is transforming. A God who has a checkered past, a God who longs for justice too. Amen.